Hey folks, welcome back to the Psychedelic Podcast. This is your host, Paul F. Austin, and today we're exploring the fascinating world of psilocybin mushrooms with food and nature writer Eugenia Bone, whose new book, Have a Good Trip, Exploring the Magic Mushroom Experience, was released on the very day of our recording back in late October 2024. Eugenia brings her journalistic rigor and personal curiosity to demystify the psilocybin experience, drawing from extensive research, interviews, and firsthand exploration. For those who aren't familiar with Eugenia, she's a distinguished writer whose work has appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and BBC Science Focus, and as the former president of the New York Mycological Society and current faculty at the New York Botanical Garden, she brings a unique perspective that bridges traditional mycology with cutting-edge psychedelic science. You may recognize her from the documentary Fantastic Fungi, where she shared her expertise alongside other leaders in the field. Speaking of Fantastic Fungi, if you enjoyed our earlier episode with Louis Schwartzberg exploring the mycelial network and symbiosis, you'll find some great parallels in today's conversation. We discuss Eugenia's journey researching and writing Have a Good Trip, the fascinating world of Seattle's quote-unquote Noccers, underground mushroom cultivation activists, her experiences with indigenous ceremonies and curanderas, the vital role of citizen science in psychedelic research, personal insights from mushroom cultivation and microdosing, and this delicate balance between wisdom and science. All right, that's it for now. Let's get into my conversation with Eugenia Bone. Eugenia, it's great to have you on the podcast. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, Paul.
So when I was doing a little bit of research before the show, I noticed that today is your publication date for Have a Good Trip. And so I thought how cool it is that you're willing to spend a little bit of time with me on this sort of day of, I don't know if it would be gestation as much as, sort of birth. And I'm just curious, like, how are you feeling after everything you've been through the last couple of years with writing this book? What does it feel like to finally get it out into the world?
Well, as I mentioned when we were talking before the show started, it's like when I'm doing a book, it takes a few years, right? And during that whole time, I'm kind of holding my breath. It's just a little anxiety producing, and I worry about all kinds of stuff. So when it's finally out, Pub Day is not a day where I'm like, yeah, party. It's more of a day where I'm like, phew. It's out there and I really can't change anything anymore. So it's time for me to see what happens. And it's a little bit of a relief. It's ultimately an exhale.
And what was the process like to write Have a Good Trip? Tell us a little bit about the creative process, the work that went into this, the exploration, maybe personal or professional, that you went through to write this book.
So I'm a independent journalist. So I'm writing nonfiction. And it's Have a Good Trip is not a memoir. It's not a guide. It's a resource and seeks to answer questions about the psychedelic experience, particularly psilocybin mushrooms. So in order to pull those resources together and to evaluate them and make sure they were that they held up to a skeptical eye, which is what I as a journalist try to bring, I used numerous sources for my research. For example, I read scientific papers and then interviewed the researchers. I reported on large-scale anecdotal data, like big surveys and things. And then I synthesized smaller-scale anecdotal data from social news sites like Reddit and Shroomery. And then I did many interviews with just regular people about their trip tales to use those as examples throughout the book. And then I did my own personal exploration. So of all the different trip types that I report on, I tried them, and I reported on the kind of things that happened to me that might be more universal, like, the sort of side effects, chills, whatever kind of things that I physically felt where they make sense in the book. I would say, well, okay, for me, I got the shakes or the postpartum like shakes during the early come on stages of a big trip, that sort of thing. So that all together hopefully creates a really a clear picture of the scene, because no one type of material or data, whether it's anecdotal or scientific, really captures the scene in its totality. I think that one has to look at all these different aspects and then evaluate them as best you can. So I paid a lot of attention to claims and analyzed a lot of things that were sort of correlative claims to see that or to show what kind of rose to a level of consistency. Like people might actually encounter these symptoms or whatever. Really, that rose to a level of as much accuracy as I could possibly generate.
So why a book about psilocybin mushrooms? You have you know, a long history being involved with mycology, being involved with mushrooms generally. As we mentioned in the introduction, you were the president of the Mycological Society in New York. Why is it that you chose to write this book specific to Psilocybe cubensis or psilocybin mushrooms?
Because they're the most commonly used mushrooms, and also because I only had like 80 to 100,000 words. So I did write a lot about some of the other psychedelic mushrooms. I went into Noccers and I wrote about Amanita muscaria. But you know, it would just have been too huge a book, one, and two, the folks that are experimenting with these other psychedelics, whether they're psilocybin based or not, tend to be like foragers, people who are hunting these mushrooms, except for the sort of strange sort of Ama subculture in the Amanita muscaria world, who are, you know, able to buy tinctures and so on. By and large, my experience is my observation is people who are taking those mushrooms are folks that are finding them for themselves. And so that's not the general audience. That's why I stayed pretty much focused on the psilocybe species, and in particular Psilocybe cubensis, because that's the most commonly consumed psychedelic mushroom.
Do you have something else to add?
Yeah, and we can talk about mycology a little bit. You know, my interest in mycology is mushrooms in general and how they fit into ecosystems, and it was no stretch to get involved in psychedelic mushrooms. I mean, it's just another aspect of mycology. It's just it's one that interfaces with, you know, the human psyche,
With consciousness, and that's I think the interesting part. Even, you know, I mentioned fantastic fungi in the beginning, the book, or I'm sorry, the documentary that Louis Schwartzberg helped to direct and produce. We had Louis on the podcast many years ago, and that was to me that was sort of like Michael Pollan, then fantastic fungi, and fantastic fungi really opened things up about mushrooms. And I'm curious how being part of that documentary changed your life. What did it do from a kind of professional career trajectory for you, if anything at all?
Not so much. You know, I wrote a book called Mycophilia many years ago, which really was the book that put me on the radar of more people than I'd ever had in my career before. And that book is why Louis invited me to be in the film. But in general, I haven't really leveraged the film, my experience in the film, in any particular way. You know, it was great to do. I'm glad it's out there. I answered a lot of questions about it. I suppose the only thing that came out of it for me personally is Louis asked me to do a fantastic fungi cookbook. And, you know, I thought about it for a while and I was like, you know, there's a lot of good forager cookbooks out there. And, you know, why would somebody want one from Eugenia Bone? And then it occurred to me, you know, I love community cookbooks. And the way Louis had started, the way Louis promoted this film, Fantastic Fungi, in the beginning, was he took it from one little theater to the next. And this is right before the pandemic. And he built that community. He connected all these people together. And I thought, wow, you know, there's this community that exists around the film. Let's reach out to them and see what mushroom recipes they have. And so we actually sourced the Fantastic Fungi community for recipes, mushroom recipes, to do a book. So we ended up making the Fantastic Fungi Community Cookbook, which is kind of fabulous. I mean, it has 50 different authors, over 50 authors. When we did our book party, it was pandemic times. Had to be on Zoom. And we had like 5 time zones or 6 time zones represented. And all these people from all over the world were, like a lot of little squares, all these cartoons of all these people who were participating in this book. I think it was probably the largest book party of authors, all together at once. Then Zoom made it possible. But it turned out to be a really wonderful experience as a food writer, because I had to test them all and I had to build the collection. And so it was a wonderful experience to, learn about all these different ways people were managing wild mushrooms. A lot of them were foragers. But also I ended up having these deep conversations with every single one of them, because I'd have to go over and say, did you really mean half a cup? And, so we'd have these complicated conversations about their recipes. And in the process, I would get to know them. So I developed all of these relationships as a result. So it was like the Fantastic Fungi Community Cookbook came out of a community and then created yet another one. You see what I mean? That was food centric. So
very mycelial of those mushrooms totally to do all that.
And the community cookbook idea really made sense for Louis, because, his operating metaphor is how mycelium connects individuals in an ecosystem, individual plants, of course, in an ecosystem. And that's his operating metaphor. And it turned out to be the operating metaphor for this book as well, which was, pretty cool, conceptually tidy.
That's very cool. So you were kind enough to send me a copy of the book beforehand, which I read through and I reviewed. And I'm going to pick out a couple interesting aspects of it. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about maybe some of the more eccentric or out of the ordinary, or, things that folks in this podcast maybe hadn't thought of or studied or heard about yet. Because, we've been hosting this podcast since 2016, and we've talked a lot about mushrooms and talked a lot about psychedelics. And yet this book is 350 pages, and it's, from what I've seen, it's the deepest dive yet into the psilocybin mushroom ecosystem or psilocybin mushroom landscape. So my sort of first question for you is, who are the renegade, and I might be mispronouncing this, the renegade Noccers of Washington who merrily disperse magic mushroom spores around Seattle?
Yeah, they're awesome. So there's lots of different ways to cultivate mushrooms, right? And magic mushrooms included, psilocybin mushrooms. But one of the most kind of elemental ways is done by Noccers. And they're called Noccers, 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 because that's short for inoculators. What they do, and the guys and gals that I know are primarily in Seattle, but they're all throughout Washington and Oregon, is that they collect the mycelium. They collect myceliated wood chips. Let me back up a little bit. So certain species of psilocybin feed on wood chips, on landscaping wood chips. And quite a long time ago, people realized that the mushrooms were growing out of landscaping wood chips all over the city, like of Seattle. Wherever landscaping wood chips were put, there would be these mushrooms popping up. However, these mushrooms will often deplete the substrate quite quickly. So in order to keep a consistent flush, what Noccers do is they collect the myceliated substrate, the myceliated wood chips, from a pile of wood chips, I don't know, like around a library, and then they move them to another location where there's fresh wood chips, where there has been a new dump of wood chips by whatever the city landscaping company. And then that creates new habitat, so more mushrooms will come up the following season. And they are so good at it. And this one guy I spoke with, I said, well, can you send me a GPS of one of your locations so I can just see the kind of place you knock? It's called knocking. And he said, sure. And this GPS location shows up on my phone. and then another, and then another. And before long, there was like 50 of them. And he said, yeah, I do about 50 a year. And I moved this mycelium around into new habitat to keep the mushrooms growing. And he said, not only that, but we also have a mole inside the city landscaping company. So we know where they're going to dump new wood chips. So they find out, and then they go and they move the mycelium onto that new landscaped area. What's more, they do things like make slurries with the psilocybin spore. So it's water and spore, and then they fill balloons with them, and then they toss them over the fences into the landscaping yards where the big piles, the original piles of of landscaping wood chips are sort of aging. There's huge piles of this wood chips that are held in the yards of various landscaping companies. So they are single-handedly keeping this kind of semi-cultivated, semi-wild population of mushrooms going in their cities. It's really like it's cultivation on a landscape scale. It's really provocative and kind of hilarious too.
It's very merry. It kind of like reminds me of the Merry Pranksters.
Totally.
A little bit. But instead of acid, instead of LSD, it's psilocybin mushrooms. And I would imagine that is also legally feasible to do because it's in Seattle, which is where a lot of these plant medicines have been decriminalized. And so they can people can have access to them. They obviously can't sell them and distribute them, but you can have access to mushrooms in Seattle and not worry that you're going to get, arrested for it, potentially.
Yeah. I mean, they're still, frankly, they're still pretty careful. They're not like being really upfront about what they're doing. They're kind of surreptitious. I think they like it that way, actually.
That's funny. So, and I imagine that probably is a very different vibe than going to Oaxaca or spending time in these indigenous places in Mexico where you're meeting or connecting with curanderas. What was it like to explore that aspect, the sort of history and lineage of the use of psilocybin mushrooms specific to Mexico?
So I didn't really do the kind of dive that an anthropologist would do, but I did report on the indigenous use as it pertained to any particular subject I was dealing with. Because the bottom line is the people of Mexico and Central America have been using these mushrooms a very long time, and they've been testing out these mushrooms on their bodies. So they have potentially have answers that we wouldn't, that are based on these many years of experience that we don't have. I mean, we in the non-indigenous world have only had access or knowledge about magic mushrooms for about 75 years. So that's like a drop in the bucket compared to those who really know. In terms of their way of using the mushrooms and their relationship with the mushrooms, it's pretty different from like going to a rave or something, going to Burning Man and taking the mushrooms. It's very solemn. It's for particular reasons. People have complaints that they look to address. When I participated in a ceremony with a curandera, she prayed and sang what seemed to me like the entire time, like, I don't know, 5 hours straight. It was, and she didn't guide people to experience things one way or another. Let me just back up and say the experience I had was really kind of a mixture of the non-indigenous and indigenous styles. For example, in the non-indigenous world, the curandera, or like the shaman, will work with a family group or with an individual who has got a complaint. Whereas in the ceremony I attended, It was a number of disparate people who were unrelated to each other, who all attended the ceremony at once, but were coming with their own personal stuff. So there was no discussion. The curandera didn't know, at least didn't know me, and I think didn't know other people that were there. In contrast, again, to in an indigenous setting, where the people who are being treated are people in the village. I mean, the curandera knows the family history. They know all kinds of things about each other. So their ability to use those mushrooms to help folks deal with whatever it is, a conflict in their culture or society, or physical or mental issues, it's a different animal than what I experienced, right? I experienced like a curandera led. So there was things that were like the indigenous, style, like that the mushrooms have been used for, and how they've been used for a very long time. But that said, as I mentioned earlier, this curandera sang the whole time. She didn't have individual interactions with us, but at one point, I mean, she really did guide the group. So at one point, someone in the group became very distressed and was doing a lot of moaning and a lot of loud crying, and you could feel in the room. Now, this is at night in the dark. We weren't blindfolded, but it was a dark room, so you couldn't see anything. But you could feel the distress rising in the room as this fellow became more and more upset. And the curandera, her singing, she was singing at the time, and her singing kind of switched gears from something that was somber to something that was more lilting and lightweight, and kind of sort of relaxed everybody. A few people laughed, and it kind of brought down the temperature. And that's when I realized that what she was doing wasn't leading people to certain realizations or whatever, to a certain experience, but she was herding us away from distress. Ultimately, everyone's doing their own thing, but she kept us on sort of the right path, I guess, as a group. So it's
almost like as guardrails. Like there's a way in which the music can create protection in the space that allows people to be harmonious or feel harmonious within themselves, even if there is this element of distress that has entered the container.
Yeah, and her ability to respond to that situation and sort of know what to do to change her song was really kind of virtuoso. It was. I felt incredibly safe, even though I didn't know the other people there. Even though I had no idea how I was going to get home after. There's a lot of questions about that particular experience, but nonetheless, that it was her. She had a sort of authority that, and definitely a lot of experience that gave me confidence that everything was going to be okay.
What was it like to grow your own mushrooms? We have a lot of folks who listen to this podcast who, if they haven't done it yet, have definitely thought about doing it and haven't pulled the trigger. And I'm curious, outside of just this journalistic effort as part of writing the book, what had you curious or interested about growing mushrooms, and how did that go for you?
Well, I have to say that I was very attached to those jars. I used the PF Tech, and I really got emotionally attached to them. I was like, they're my babies. But a few of them were great and worked out okay, but most of them just got kind of slimy. And you'll see if you go on to onto threads like on Shroomery, and people will say, there's green snot-like stuff growing on my mushrooms. Is it okay? I mean, it's just, they're so vulnerable to so many different pathogens that are just kind of floating around in the environment. It's super, super hard to control. And yet at the same time, I read about and spoke with numerous people who are like, these mushrooms were disgusting. They were full of, black slime. I chucked the diseased matrix into a flower pot, and then the mushrooms came up. It's just such a degree of mystery. Although there are very accomplished mushroom growers out there, I'm not one. But I did find that it's, I don't know, I think that people can get very attached to their plants. I've never been so much like recognizing my plants as individuals, but with the mushrooms, wow, I guess it's because we're kind of close on the tree of life, but I really connected with those little jars. I was like, you're going to make it, you're going to make it. And then you even birth the jars, when after they've myceliated, so the matrix inside the jars has completely been consumed by mycelium. So it's all white inside the jars. And then you birth them onto another matrix and that's what produces the mushrooms. And that it's at that time it produces the mushrooms because the mycelium has used up all of the nutrients. It's ready to produce mushrooms to get their spores out of there and find new habitat. And birthing them was like, you're going to be okay. Boom, boom. It was a wonderful, I don't know. But I've heard this before about cultivators talking about their mushrooms in these really affectionate ways, which is silly, but it also kind of is of a part with the fact that a lot of people that grow mushrooms that I interviewed won't sell them. They'll give them away, or they'll take the mushrooms in some kind of group that they're involved in, but they're not
Why won't they
necessarily
sell
put
them?
up for sale because they just think it's tacky. Believe it or not. I mean, they got other jobs or stuff. They're kind of growing it as a hobby. But it's one that they have like a lot of reverence for these remarkable mushrooms. So it's like I don't know, it's like growing something very special and they treat it that way.
Well, and many, that makes sense. Like I was just staying with a friend up in the East Bay of San Francisco, and her dad has a massive garden and he grows, all types of fruit trees and vegetables and things like that. And, friends would come by or come over, and he's not going to try to sell these fruits that grow in his garden to the friends. They'll just give away the extra that he's not going to eat himself. And I feel like with mushrooms, it's very similar. You're not going to try to tackily sell these and become a quote unquote drug dealer. You're going to be like, okay, I will probably, I'll microdose with, some of these, or maybe I'll do a high dose journey once every few months. And as you probably experience with mushroom flushes, I mean, some of those flushes are huge. You're getting 50, 100, 150, 200 grams, it's like, and that's for me, like there's so much a conversation about accessibility in psychedelics. And I think what a lot of people don't count on is as it becomes easier and easier for people to grow mushrooms, ideally we have a surplus of mushrooms. Like there's going to be ideally more mushrooms than anyone could take in, a single year.
It's not a very profitable business to be selling mushrooms. I mean, this one fellow who was involved in the early years in the 70s of identifying wild psychedelic mushrooms, and then they figured out how to grow them. He said that in no time, the value of the mushrooms that he was growing, the value to sell, dropped because people started growing them all over. All these different people started growing them for themselves. And so the market was, not sustainable from his point of view.
The other thing that I wanted to ask about was citizen science. We've had some researchers who have come on the podcast. We've had some, healers, therapists, medical doctors who have come on the podcast. We've talked at length about the clinical research that's happened with synthetic psilocybin in places like Johns Hopkins and NYU for depression, addiction, alcoholism, end-of-life anxiety. And we did have Paul Stamets on the show a couple years ago, and he talked a little bit about quantified citizen and citizen science. And I'd love to hear your lens on why is it that you think citizen science is so central to our understanding of how psilocybin works, and why is it also a great balancing to some of the more buttoned up FDA approved efforts to, medicalize and regulate synthetic psilocybin?
I think for me, and from what I've determined from my work, is that the citizen science in psychedelics is kind of at its most powerful when it leads the science. So, for example, with cluster headache sufferers, you had these folks suffering from these insanely horrible migraine-like headaches. They call them suicide headaches. One guy I spoke to a migraine specialist who's studying psilocybin. One guy, the headaches were so bad that he shot himself in the eye, trying to stop this headache. He didn't hurt it. He recovered thoroughly, believe it or not, but his headaches came back. Cluster headaches are terrible. And so folks and there's not a really good not a great medication for them. It doesn't work for everybody and so on. So there's a website, clusterbusters.com, that started to put up where people would put up their various kind of things, tips they were doing to try to counteract these terrible headaches. And psilocybin came up, and more people started trying mushrooms and reporting on their efficacy. And that led to a researcher or two saying, that's interesting. Let's design a study to see, what we can find out about this. So that's a case of citizen science leading the science. Folks are experimenting on themselves. Microdosing is the same thing. People are microdosing and they are reporting their data to surveys and things like that. But it's not a clinical trial, and it doesn't have the sort of controls of a clinical trial, but it's still data. And that's why the scientists look at all that microdosing testimonial and data and they go, maybe we should design some studies to see what's going on here. So that's what I think the real role of citizen science in this psychedelic sphere, what it really is. It also, can go into all kinds of sort of side streets, like the folks that are experimenting with multiple psychedelics, like doing hippie flipping and things like that, taking psilocybin and then taking MDMA. That is data that, if a researcher says, look, it's proving some efficacy, we're going to try to figure out what's going on. It helps them anticipate where the science might lead. I don't see them as the citizen science and clinical research as being mutually exclusive.
Sure.
I see them as two sides of the same story. There is worries on both ends, like when it comes to clinical trials, there's always the worries of, kind of capitalist inputs that might make people suspicious of the results. And with anecdotal data, it's people telling their story, and they can tell it any way they want, and they could have any sort of comorbidities, who knows? So both have their pros and cons. And the more they work together, I think the further along our knowledge of what these drugs can do improves.
Yeah, when back in the day, I was hanging out with Jim Fadiman at a MAPS conference. This is 2017. And I remember something that he said that stuck with me, which is like his job is to do the search, meaning to sort of go out in front to search what are some patterns that we're starting to notice. This is early days in microdosing, about what it's helping with, what it's not helping with. And then with those large data sets, I think the first data set he published that he presented on in 2017 was something like 400 people. And what they found is this looks like it could generally be helpful for depression. That was sort of like probably the main takeaway. And now you have clinical trials that are happening many years onwards of biotech companies that are exploring LSD and psilocybin to help with, I believe, major depressive disorder and then also postpartum depression. If I'm not mistaken, I think this is what Mycomedica is working on in Australia. So there's now, more sort of clinical focuses that are based on diagnoses that could potentially help, people.
You have to have like some controls for a clinical trial, and unfortunately, a lot of the hype and excitement that people have about, larger dose use is based on very small sample sets, very small data sets. So clinical trials in many cases, for all of these different mental illnesses like OCD and PTSD and depression and anorexia nervosa and so on, are all small groups of people. So when you we need these new drugs. We need new drugs. We need to get some more answers. So people are very eager to jump to the conclusion that yes, these drugs are going to solve the problem. But the data set is so small, it doesn't account for all kinds of things. Drug interactions, like if you're diabetic and you're taking, insulin, is that going to interact weirdly? I mean,
Right.
It's just, there's a lot that's unknown. And so kind of moderating at recognizing that science and any kind of data, really, it goes slow, and it has to be kind of careful to be accurate. And I think that's where we're at. We're at this place right now where I'm hoping that more people are saying, hold on for a second, and let's see what these trials are actually saying, instead of jumping the gun and assuming that I got depression, so I'm going to take 5 grams of psilocybin cubensis and hope for the best.
Right. Which may help, but also there may be certain risks that come up.
Totally.
And there may be contraindications that are present. It's not a silver bullet or panacea. And especially when you have someone who's been on SSRIs for 10, 20, 30 years, nothing else has really worked. They're still stuck in this sort of, state of anhedonia, and they're looking for anything that could potentially help that. Psilocybin does look like, for many of these people, a very attractive option if they're willing to go that route. And there's a lot of potential challenges that may arise during that process that require professional support.
Exactly. And just, being a kind of, I hate to sound a little Ralph Nader-ish, but being a concern, being an informed consumer is the best thing you can do with this right now. The bottom line is the drug is, illegal federally. So you're kind of on your own. And so the more you can understand and figure out, there's a lot of knowns, there's a lot of unknowns, and there's a lot of unknowables because of this. Right. What's in each one of our brains.
I love that. What was your experience like with microdosing?
With microdosing? Mm-hmm. So microdosing, I don't suffer from the blues, right? I don't have depression. Mm-hmm. I took microdosing in the hopes of like a work enhancement or focus, which is another, well-known attribute, as you know. It took me a while to titrate and find the dose that I didn't feel. In my book, I say a subperceptual dose, but in retrospect, I think that a better term, like I'd like to correct myself. This is one of the things that, had me holding my breath for so many years is a better word would be intoxication, because it should be perceptible, but just not intoxifying, right? You're not feeling high or dizzy or anything like that. So after titrating to find that place for myself, and then after following a protocol and doing it for about a month, what was revealed to me was not so much an improvement in my focus or creativity, both of which, look, Paul, at my age, I know how to turn it on. When I sit down, I know how to turn it on. That's not my problem. I can get into that zone fast. The problem is I'm like this. I'm just hunched up. Am I getting it right? Am I fucking it up? Do I remember everything? I get into this almost like panic state when I'm writing. It's almost like a little anxiety. What microdosing did for me is it removed that little piece. And I felt it's not like it helped me do anything. It didn't add anything. The microdosing subtracted something that was getting in my way, that made writing, that made working, at times a pretty uncomfortable experience. I had neck pain for most of my writing life. And after microdosing, I was realizing it was because I was like in fight or flight, thinking I was screwing up or not doing a good enough job or whatever my BS is. And so once that seemed to be suppressed or relieved or just not my focus anymore, I still had my focus. I still had my creativity. It was a much better experience for me as a writer.
That's beautiful to hear. Yeah, it can help with that responsiveness, creating a little bit of spaciousness for us to bring awareness to how we might be physically sitting, to how we might be emotionally projecting, to how we might be, clenching. I've noticed sometimes when I microdose, I'm much more aware of when and how I clench my jaw, as an example. So it just kind of brings this attunement.
Yeah, I think that despite the fact that you don't feel anything, if it's working for you, it is a somatic, well, for me, it was like a somatic experience. So it was embodied. It was not really so mental. On the other hand, I don't know, for other people, they have nothing, they give it up because they have no experience from it. It doesn't affect them one way or the other. So it's a very subjective and very curious phenomenon that I really look forward to seeing how the microdosing studies they're having trouble figuring. Some of the researchers I spoke with were like, yeah, we think there's some problems with our study designs because the anecdotal data that it's effective for many people is strong, but when we did a study, it's like no more effective than a placebo. So they're like, maybe it's the design study. Anyway, I'm looking forward to seeing what emerges on this topic.
Yeah, my hope is that they will find a balance between, let's say, citizen science, or you could even call it naturalistic use, and clinical research. And they've actually done this in New Zealand, where a company called Mind Biotherapeutics has set up a clinical trial. They're in phase 2 trials. They send people home with 10 micrograms of LSD and say, just take it in your everyday life and then report back and let us know. And I think some of the problems with some of the initial experimental design when it was showing, microdosing is no better than placebos, because people were taking a microdose and then sitting in a lab room for 6 hours doing these very sort of mundane and mechanistic tests. And so I do think there needs to be a bit more flexibility with the naturalistic use of it. And then ideally, you could do psychometric tests. You could also do blood work. There might be other ways to then track and measure if this is just the one variable that has shifted in their lives. What are other things that also might start to shift and change as a result?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the study designs, that's true for large dose psychedelics as well. The study designs are evolving. It's a whole different deal than like studying an antacid.
Correct.
So it's curious to see the how those challenges are being met. And I know that it's a big deal. I was recently at the opera, and I got my ticket as a gift from a friend, and he had also given it to some other friends. So I was sitting next to this woman, and we were like, "Hi, what do you do?" And I said, "Well, I'm a writer. I just wrote a book about psychedelic mushrooms." And she said, "Oh, I work for a psychedelic pharmaceutical company, and I'm the clinical trials design executive." And I was like, forget the opera. I was just focused on her. And, she's obviously, she works for a publicly traded company, so she can't tell me that much. But she was saying that developing a design for psychedelic drugs is a challenge because it's just so different from what is the norm for drugs in the United States that are approved by the FDA.
Totally. And this is what MAPS experienced when they attempted to get MDMA approved a few months ago, that combining it with therapy, the FDA does not regulate therapy. It has to be purely about the drug itself. But these aren't like SSRIs where you just take it or anti-anxiety medications. We all know that when you're taking a high dose of a psychedelic, there's a lot more that comes up that sometimes requires that professional support and guidance. So It is tricky to navigate. It's a totally new paradigm of use in many ways,
Totally.
and
Yeah.
the old paradigm cannot really contain it.
Yeah. So it's, I mean, it's a beautiful challenge. It's curious, but it's one of the reasons why people have to be patient,
Right.
and accept that there's a lot of work that has to be done that's structural as well.
Okay, so the name of the book is Have a Good Trip, Exploring the Magic Mushroom Experience. So my final question for you is going to be, this is a 340-page book. You spent, 2 years writing it, but probably an even longer amount of time doing research for it. If you had to provide sort of a few words of wisdom for someone who wants to have a good trip with psilocybin mushrooms, what would you say based on all of this research and firsthand experiences and everything that you've gone through over the past years as you've navigated the mushroom?
I would say the kind of bottom line is the mushroom is not the cure. It's the experience that offers a cure or cures or insights or revelations. It's the experience, and the experience is utterly subjective and related to numerous factors, including dose, where your mind's at, setting, the environment you're in, the people who are there when you're in this vulnerable state. There is no there's definitely things about the mushroom that a lot of folks experience, like having mystical experiences or feeling oneness with nature, having insights and revelations into your own behavior, a sort of subjective viewpoint. An objective viewpoint. All of that can happen, and none of it. The bottom line is it's all in your own mind.
I don't know if you ever read Borges, the Argentinian writer who wrote Labyrinths, this collection of essays, and talks about the sort of metaphysic of idealism, which is we are constantly creating the universe, right? And the mind is sort of at the center of that creation. And one of the beautiful aspects about psychedelics is they, more than anything, help us, depending on how you look at it, either remember that or wake up to that perspective. And so they are a catalyst, they are an opener, they can bring us into these mystical states or these non-dual states. And as you emphasize, so much of it is the container that we are brought into, the ceremony, the ritual, the lineage, the traditions, the guidance or the hand-holding, the compassion in the space, right? That they bring us into this ultra-sensitive space where we can repattern ourselves. But at the end of the day, they are just a tool to get us to a place that we could access otherwise. It's often difficult. It seems inaccessible, especially in a sort of distracted modern world. But the states they bring us into are universal, and both totally subjective.
Yeah, but totally subjective. And, you can have the most ideal setup, go in with the best possible circumstances, and what bubbles up in your mind is, that's the unknowable factor of all of this.
You never know what might happen, right? That's part of it. It's the mystery of it, right? That's why I think people are drawn to psychedelics. In
and it's also why we can't afford to poo-poo the complaints of anyone who feels extended difficulties or who has a bad trip. We can't gaslight them, but that experience they have is as much a real experience as one that helps you, resolve your problem with your mother. So, that it has to be this whole picture, in my view, in order to really, in order for people to maybe be prepared for the great mystery of these remarkable mushrooms.
So thank you, Eugenia Bone, for joining us. Have a good trip exploring the magic mushroom experience. Your personal website is Eugenia, that's EUGENIA, Bone, BONE.com. Any other places you'd like to encourage people to check out, or resources, or just any sort of final words you'd like to share with the audience today?
Yeah, I post all kinds of talks and things like that on Instagram just because it's like easier. I can do it on my phone. So that's a good place to go. And I use Eugenia Bone. That's it. Take a look at the book. And if your auntie is psychedelic curious and saying, oh, maybe I'll try, please put her to my book. It might
It's a good Christmas
keep her out
present.
of trouble. Yeah.
It's a good Christmas present. Fantastic. Well, Eugenia, thank you again for all the work you put into writing this book and for joining us on the podcast. It was fun to interview you today.
Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Hey listeners, Paul here. I hope you enjoyed our episode today with Eugenia Bone. A quick reminder to head to the link in the description of this episode to see the full show notes and any of the links that we mentioned in this episode. And we'd love to know what you thought of the conversation. Head to Third Wave's free community platform at community.thethirdwave.co to share your perspectives and insights. Also, make sure to follow the Psychedelic Podcast wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. And if you found this episode to be inspiring or helpful, please consider sharing it with a friend. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next week. Thanks so much for watching. If you want to grow your own medicine from microdosing or high-dose experiences, check out our Mushroom Grow Kit. It's the simplest way to get a reliable source of high-quality mushrooms, and it includes detailed videos walking you through the entire process. No guessing, just clear instructions for best results. Check out the link in the description below.